I once spent an afternoon observing a friend of mine, a brilliant engineer who also happens to be on the autism spectrum. He had just come home from a corporate networking mixer, the kind of soft skills nightmare where everyone wears a polite, beige smile and speaks in the muffled language of double meanings. He looked physically gray, his eyes glazed over from the sheer exhaustion of navigating a world where maybe means no and we should do lunch means never call me. He didn't say a word. He just slumped onto his sofa, reached for his remote, and put on an episode of One Piece. As the vibrant, exaggerated colors flooded the room and the characters began shouting their intentions with world-shaking clarity, I watched the tension literally drain out of his shoulders. To an outsider, it looked like a simple retreat, a grown man escaping into a childish fantasy to avoid the real world. There's this common, slightly condescending assumption that for neurodivergent people, manga and anime are just fixations, a way to hide from the complexities of human life. But as I watched him, I realized he wasn't zoning out, he was calibrating. While his office felt like a lottery held by ghosts full of shifting rules and social traps, the world on the screen was governed by an ironclad internal logic. In the anime, if a character made a promise, it was a contract. If they felt agony, the animation made it visible, readable, and honest. There were no corporate masks here. The absurd world of the manga was actually more coherent than the normal world he had just left. It made me realize we've had the cultural diagnosis all wrong. For many autistic people, these stories aren't a flight from reality. They are a rescue from the incoherence of it. It's not that they can't handle complexity, it's that they can't stand the dishonesty of polite society. It raises a fascinating question. What if the reason so many neurotypical minds flock to these atypical stories isn't because they're lost in a fantasy, but because they've finally found a world that has decency, to be honest?
Yeah, and the mechanics of that calibration process, they're rooted so deeply in the fundamental differences of how neurotypical minds process visual and social information.
Right.
So the mission for this deep dive is really to unpack that intersection. We're looking at neurology, visual culture, and the built environment of narrative. We need to map out exactly how these specific mediums provide structural relief for cognitive frameworks that are just completely overwhelmed by modern social interaction.
And I think we have to start by tackling a massive misunderstanding about facial recognition.
Absolutely.
There's this long-standing assumption, right, that individuals on the autism spectrum just have this innate inability to understand human facial expressions. It gets treated like a biological hardware failure.
Right. The clinical observation is always they struggle with nonverbal communicative behaviors. And so the leap in logic is that the neurodivergent brain is just blind to the data.
Which completely mischaracterizes the environment they're actually navigating.
Exactly. The issue isn't an inability to read data. The issue is that the data neurotypical society presents is just inherently corrupt.
Yeah.
The reality of polite society is that human faces are constantly shrouded in these layers of, well, performative ambiguity.
So imagine you're standing at a corporate mixer. A colleague walks up to you and smiles. In a purely logical framework, a smile means happiness or maybe agreement. But in the context of neurotypical professional environments, a smile frequently masks frustration or impatience.
Or condescension.
Or professional jealousy.
Exactly. Or a furrowed brow might mean deep, engaged concentration.
Yeah.
But it could just as easily signal suppressed anger.
And so the facial data in those real-world interactions is incredibly noisy, it's contradictory, it's highly contextual.
Yes.
When a neurodivergent person, especially a visual thinker, looks at a neurotypical face in that environment, they aren't just looking at geometric features, they're forced into this state of active decryption.
They have to decode the discrepancy between the physical expression and the hidden intention behind it. Right. And the cognitive load required to do that is enormous. It's basically the mental equivalent of running a heavily demanding background app on your phone that just drains the battery and slows down everything else.
Because the brain is constantly asking, does this arrangement of facial muscles actually match their emotional state, or is this a simulation?
Exactly. And that specific processing burden perfectly explains why Japanese media manga and anime specifically provide such a profound sense of coherence.
Japanese visual language?
It's JVL. It basically acts as a cognitive Rosetta Stone for visual thinkers. The structural differences between JVL and traditional Western comic art are neurologically huge.
Yeah, consider the trajectory of Western comic books for a second. For decades, the stylistic drive has been toward realism, right? Complex, shifting facial geometry.
Right, trying to mimic the subtle play of light and shadow, the microscopic musculature you'd see in a photograph.
Exactly. So the reader gets these highly rendered faces that carry all the ambiguous, subtle markers of real human expressions.
But Japanese visual language takes the exact opposite approach. Manga utilizes highly schematized, iconic faces.
Right.
Characters aren't deliberately differentiated by subtle shifts in bone structure, or cheekbone heights, or facial tics. They're defined by a single, highly salient, unmistakable feature.
Like, you have an entire narrative universe where one character is defined entirely by spiky black hair that totally defies gravity, and another character is defined exclusively by, light blue bangs falling asymmetrically across their eyes. The geometry of the face itself, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, is simplified down to just a few really clean, distinct lines.
And that stylistic choice of radical simplification performs a crucial neurological function. It strips away the cognitive load of decoding microexpressions.
It just removes it completely.
Right. By reducing the human face to an iconic schema, the visual data becomes clean, sorted, and immediately actionable. You don't have to sift through the noise of realistic musculature to guess the emotion. The signal is pure.
But JVL goes even further than just simplifying the face, right? Because it employs this highly standardized symbolic vocabulary to externalize internal states.
Yes, emanata.
Emanata. It functions as a set of universally agreed upon visual symbols that just instantly broadcast complex internal emotions without any ambiguity whatsoever.
The application of emanata is incredibly precise. In manga, a massive teardrop-shaped icon appearing on the side of a character's head universally and exclusively means anxiety or exasperation or tension.
There's no room for alternate interpretation.
A bursting, cross-shaped vein icon popping up on a forehead that broadcasts hidden anger or intense irritation. A sudden bloody nose instantly communicates sexual arousal or intense infatuation.
I mean, these are not subtle cues.
No.
They're explicit visual broadcasts of internal emotional realities. And when you combine that standardized vocabulary with physical caricature, like when a character is profoundly sad, they don't just look downward with a slight frown.
Right. The sadness is externalized to the point of literally altering the physical environment. Tears physically stream out of their eyes like pressurized geysers or waterfalls.
The physical world warps to accommodate the scale of the emotion.
Exactly. The visual output is a one-to-one match with the internal state. There is zero discrepancy between what the character feels internally and what they show externally.
Which, for an individual who spends their entire day deciphering neurotypical riddles, creates an environment of absolute emotional honesty.
It's a massive relief.
But okay, let me push back on this framework for a second. Because if a character has waterfalls literally shooting out of their eyes when they're sad, or a giant pulsating vein on their head when they're angry, isn't that just bad writing? And there's an argument frequently levied by Western literary critics that this complete lack of subtlety is a severe flaw in storytelling. It gets dismissed as a narrative immaturity, right? An inability to convey emotion through nuance. Are we really classifying a lack of nuance as an advanced form of clarity?
We have to decouple the concept of nuance from the concept of value.
Okay.
In a neurotypical social structure, nuance is highly valued because it allows people to maintain social hierarchy without direct confrontation. Nuance is the primary tool of politeness, but from a strictly cognitive perspective, nuance is just data encryption.
Wow, data encryption.
Yeah, for a mind that demands logical consistency and direct communication, nuance isn't sophisticated. It's inefficient, and honestly, it's dishonest.
So the lack of subtlety is entirely the point.
Exactly. The individual navigating this medium no longer has to guess if a smell is a threat. If a character is angry, the visual language guarantees you will know it immediately and unequivocally. The narrative immaturity argument completely misses the functional utility of the medium.
It provides a sanctuary of legibility.
Yeah. And beyond the emotional clarity of the faces, the physical structure of manga empowers pattern thinkers through absolute spatial and temporal control.
Because many individuals on the autism spectrum possess exceptional visuospatial skills, right?
Yeah.
And this intense affinity for identifying pattern.
Right, and manga heavily leverages that specific cognitive profile. While the characters themselves are highly schematized, the backgrounds are frequently hyper-detailed, photorealistic, or they use specific, repeating geometric patterns to dictate the mood of the scene.
Which creates a highly stable, predictable, and visually rich environment that anchors those simplified characters. The brain is fed a consistent visual rhythm.
Furthermore, the layout of the panels themselves hands the control of time directly to the reader.
Which is a huge divergence from reality.
In a real-world social interaction, the pacing is relentless. It's linear, and it's entirely uncontrollable by any single participant. The conversation moves forward regardless of whether the autistic individual has finished processing the social and verbal data of the last sentence.
Right. If you miss a cue in a real-time conversation, the moment is just gone. The social deficit compounds immediately.
But through the physical structure of a manga page, the reader dictates the flow of time. You can linger on a single panel, internalize the spatial information, decode the emotion using the emanata, and move forward strictly at your own required cognitive pace.
You're never left behind by the speed of the interaction.
Never. And the medium also uses techniques like subjective motion to further anchor spatial awareness.
Right, instead of drawing a character moving horizontally across a static background, which makes the reader a passive observer ruler, manga artists frequently use densely packed, streaked background lines converging on the character to create the sensation of intense motion.
And that technique places the reader at the exact center of the action. You aren't watching the movement happen from the sidelines. You are anchored in the space, moving alongside the narrative focus. The environment moves around you.
Which provides a profound sense of grounding for a mind that often feels detached from the chaotic movement of the physical world.
Exactly. And this profound structural control extends far beyond just visual processing. It intersects directly with the mechanics of executive function.
Yeah, the internal logic of these stories provides a sturdy, predictable framework. And for many people, this framework is actually exported out of the fictional universe and applied to real life to manage the overwhelming demands of daily survival.
Which brings us to Elias.
Yes, to understand how this works in practice, imagine you are standing in a university library in Berlin. This was the reality for a young man named Elias. The physical sensory weight of the room is immense. The smell of decaying paper and floor wax is sharp. The relentless, low-frequency hum of the fluorescent lights is practically vibrating in your jaw, and Elias is staring at a to-do list on his desk. But to him, it doesn't look like a plan. It looks like a pile of jagged, broken glass.
The sheer terror of the open-endedness of adult life is paralyzing for someone with profound executive dysfunction. Tasks don't naturally organize themselves into a hierarchy of importance.
Right. The lack of clear, immediate consequences and the absence of immediate rewards make it nearly impossible to even initiate a task. Every single item on Elias's list carries the exact same psychological weight.
Buying groceries feels just as insurmountable as writing a 30-page thesis.
Exactly. The vague, abstract demands of being a functional student offer absolutely no grip. So to survive this environment, Elias retreated into the highly structured world of shounen battle anime.
Right, which is a specific demographic classification of Japanese media that relies heavily on structured conflict, continuous training, and explicit power scaling.
Yeah.
Within this subgenre, the narrative universes are governed by magic systems or power systems that operate on rigid, transparent, and immutable laws.
The most prominent example being the law of equivalent exchange.
Exactly. The rule is absolute. If you expend X amount of energy or sacrifice a specific material, you achieve exactly Y result. There are no shortcuts.
The universe is inherently transactional, mathematical, and entirely fair. If a character puts in the exact requisite effort, the outcome is guaranteed by the physics of the narrative.
And Elias didn't simply consume these shows passively as entertainment. He actively utilized their internal logic as a psychological scaffolding for his own life.
When his actual environment felt like an unpredictable mess of contradictory social expectations and shifting academic deadlines, he imported the rules of the anime directly into his daily routine.
He mapped his day exactly like an anime training arc.
Right, he assigned a specific mana cost to his daily chores. The abstract, overwhelming concept of cleaning the kitchen was translated into a fixed mathematical value. Washing the dishes cost exactly 30 mana. Taking out the trash costs 15 mana.
And he's assigned stat boosts to his study sessions. Reading a single chapter of his macroeconomics textbook yielded a guaranteed +5 to his intelligence stat.
Which is a highly effective coping strategy. It immediately turns a vague, overwhelming obligation into a closed transactional loop.
It softens the vulnerability of being a 22-year-old who frequently forgets to eat or sleep due to executive paralysis. The narrative dictates that even the most fractured, disadvantaged protagonist can succeed if they meticulously follow the internal rules of their world.
And the show's narrative consistency provided a mental safety rail that the university environment entirely lacked. The rules of the university were shifting constantly. The rules of the mana system were ironclad.
What Elias is doing here actually has a formal name in the psychology and counseling world. It's a methodology known as geek therapy.
Right.
And the foundational premise of geek therapy relies on a specific formula. Affinities plus resonance equals understanding. or A plus R equals U.
So the therapy doesn't view an obsessive interest as a pathology to be redirected. It views the affinity as a tool.
By leveraging a deep affinity, in Elias's case, shounen battle anime, that heavily resonates with his internal need for structure and predictability, he could achieve a profound regulation of his own behavior.
And to understand the mechanics of that regulation, we can map Elias's strategy directly onto the expressive therapies continuum, commonly referred to as the ETC model.
Right, the ETC framework is a way of understanding how human beings process information and interact with media. It moves through a hierarchy of distinct processing levels.
The foundation of the ETC model is the kinesthetic and sensory level, right? This involves simple, rhythmic, physical movements and direct sensory engagement.
Yes. And then the next level up is the affective and perceptual level, where individuals process raw emotions and identify basic forms and patterns.
And the highest level of the continuum is the cognitive and symbolic level.
Exactly. This is where complex planning, abstract thought, and the creation of meaning occur. And the cognitive and symbolic layer is exactly where Elias is operating.
Because the abstract, chaotic demands of a neurotypical university environment, like vague instructions from professors or unstructured study time, are inherently unmanageable for a brain dealing with severe executive dysfunction. He literally cannot process those demands directly at the cognitive level because the data is too messy.
So by engaging with the highly symbolic layer of the anime, importing the concepts of mana, stat boosts, and clear rules of equivalent exchange, Elias creates a functional bridge.
Yeah.
He takes the unmanageable external demands and translates them into a gamified internal language based on his beloved affinity.
Because the task of studying for finals is massive, it's ill-defined, and it's terrifying. You start, when are you finished?
Right.
But the task of grinding experience points to level up my intelligence stat before the Bach battle at the end of the semester, that provides immediate systemic clarity. You know exactly what action yields what points, and you know exactly how many points you need to survive.
And this process of translation transforms chaotic external noise into a manageable closed system. The anime essentially provides a narrative architecture that supports and eventually replaces his failing executive function. The media operates as a cognitive prosthesis.
Fascinating. So we've established how the medium acts as a translator for emotional processing through visual language, and how it functions as a daily planner and scaffolding for executive function. But that is largely dealing with how an individual manages the external world. We have to pivot to what happens when the individual looks inwards. How do these intense, highly structured stories validate the neurodivergent sense of identity?
The cultural framing of character archetypes in Japanese media offers a profoundly different reflection for neurodivergent individuals compared to the tropes found in Western media. The difference in how atypical traits are narratively punished or rewarded completely shapes the self-concept of the viewer.
Consider the story of Sarah. Growing up in Seattle, Sarah constantly felt like a ghost haunting her own house. The rhythmic, monotonous thumping of the windshield wipers on a typical gray Pacific Northwest afternoon always seemed to perfectly match the low-level anxiety humming constantly in her chest. Every time she looked at Western media, she was told that her autistic traits had to fit neatly into one of two highly restrictive categories.
Right. Western storytelling traditionally relies on two extreme binaries for neurodivergent representation. The first is the tragic deficit model,
Where the character is portrayed as a burden.
Exactly. They're entirely defined by their inability to connect, and the narrative arc is solely focused on curing them or forcing them to assimilate into neurotypical norms.
And the second category is the robotic superpower model. The character is allowed to be socially abrasive or entirely disconnected, but only because they possess an invaluable machine-like utility to the neurotypical protagonist.
They're the human calculator, the flawless hacker, the brilliant but rude detective.
Right. But neither of those tropes reflects the lived reality of a neurodivergent human being. They don't allow for humanity. They demand either a cure or an extraction of utility.
And Sarah knew she wasn't a tragedy that needed to be fixed, and she certainly wasn't a flawless calculating machine. She was just intensely, exhaustingly herself.
It wasn't until she discovered the intense, highly specific character archetypes of 1990s Japanese psychological anime that she finally saw a reflection of her own internal landscape.
Because Japanese media frequently creates space for intense, obsessive, and socially jagged character archetypes without instinctively pathologizing them through a neurotypical lens. The narrative universe doesn't demand that the character undergo a metamorphosis to become outgoing, warm, or socially fluid by the end of the story, just to achieve a valid happy ending.
So one rainy Tuesday afternoon, Sarah was sitting alone in her car. The condensation was heavily fogging the windows, blurring the outside world. She was crying after a failed job interview, and the feedback she had received from the interviewer was brief and devastating. She was dismissed for lacking warmth.
Wow.
Yeah. Her technical skills were perfect, but she failed the invisible social test.
And in that moment of profound rejection by neurotypical standards, she didn't look for a story about someone learning to smile better.
No. She pulled out her phone and pulled up a specific clip of a stoic, hyperfixated female pilot from a classic mecha series. The low, mechanical hum of the anime mecha engine filled the quiet space of her car, and she just watched this character operate.
See, in the context of Western media, a character with a flat affect, intense hyperfixation on machinery, and a complete lack of social warmth would immediately be relegated to the role of a quirky sidekick.
Right. Or framed as a problem that the warm, empathetic protagonist needed to solve.
Exactly. But in this Japanese narrative, this hyperfixated pilot was the absolute center of the universe.
Yeah.
She wasn't a sidekick. She was respected specifically for her precision, her deep focus, and her silence.
The narrative world demanded those exact traits for survival.
Her intense focus and flat affect were simply accepted as a necessary variation of the human experience within that fictional universe. The narrative didn't require her to learn small talk to pilot the machine.
And Sarah didn't need a miracle cure, and she didn't need to learn how to mimic the beige smiles of the corporate networking mixer. She needed proof that her specific, jagged way of being human existed somewhere in the cultural imagination as a position of strength, not a deficit.
Right.
In the sharp, uncompromising lines of that Japanese character, Sarah finally found a mirror that didn't demand she distort herself to see her own inherent value.
And this phenomenon of finding identity mirrors in Japanese media has significant gendered dimensions that really must be explored.
Yeah.
The experience of autism in women and girls involves intense societal pressure to engage in heavy social masking. Neurotypical female socialization heavily values complex, implicit communication, subtle emotional networking, and the constant maintenance of group harmony.
And for a neurodivergent girl, attempting to constantly mimic that implicit communication is neurologically exhausting. It requires manually calculating social dynamics that neurotypical peers process automatically.
Consequently, a significant number of neurodivergent women and girls gravitate toward anime, comics, and games communities, widely referred to as ACG subcultures.
Which makes total sense.
Right. These digital and physical subcultures offer a vital form of social inclusion. The inclusion is based almost entirely on shared hyperfixations, deep lore knowledge, and structured enthusiasm, rather than the exhausting real-time performance of face-to-face emotional reciprocity.
But the fact that these Japanese characters and ACG communities provide such perfect mirrors exposes a massive failure in our own cultural storytelling. The relentless demand in Western media that every protagonist be inherently warm, accessible, and socially fluid actively invalidates millions of minds.
And when a neurodivergent individual finds a substantially better cultural fit in the media of a foreign nation, it forces us to ask a much deeper scientific question. It moves beyond media analysis and enters the realm of cross-cultural neurology. Right? How does the surrounding cultural environment fundamentally alter the way an autistic mind interacts with the world?
We're essentially asking if the social deficits associated with autism are absolute biological facts, or if they are highly dependent on the cultural rules of the society the person happens to live in.
And this exact question brings us to the absolute core of modern autism research: the double empathy problem. To understand the double empathy problem, we have to first understand the theory it replaced. For decades, the dominant, unquestioned medical model claimed that autistic people simply lacked a theory of mind.
Right. Theory of mind is the cognitive ability to understand that other people have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that are fundamentally different from your own.
Exactly. The medical establishment looked at the communication breakdowns between autistic and non-autistic people and concluded, definitively, that the autistic person was simply broken. The deficit resided entirely within the autistic individual.
But recent psychological science has entirely flipped this arrogant assumption. The double empathy problem posits that communication breakdowns are not a one-way failure. They are a bidirectional mismatch.
Right.
The theory states that neurotypical people are just as terrible at reading and understanding the internal states of autistic people as autistic people are at reading neurotypicals. It is a failure of mutual translation.
It's not a solo deficit. It's two different operating systems trying to share files without a compatible formatting drive.
And to prove this bidirectional mismatch, Researchers rely on a really fascinating psychological assessment known as the triangle animations task.
The triangle animations task removes human faces entirely to isolate the cognitive processing of social intention. Participants sit in front of a screen and watch short, highly abstracted animations of interacting geometric shapes, specifically a large red triangle and a small blue triangle moving around a bordered space.
Right.
The participant is asked to describe the social intentions happening on screen. Are the triangles coaxing each other? Are they mocking each other? Are they trying to trick one another?
And in a major landmark study conducted in the UK by a researcher named Schuster and colleagues, they added a brilliant technological twist to the standard task. Instead of just having participants watch pre-made animations, they had both autistic and non-autistic adults generate their own animations.
Right.
They gave them a touchscreen device and told them to move the triangles to depict specific mental state interactions like persuading or mocking.
And the touchscreen device was crucial because it recorded the exact kinematic data of the participants' finger movements. It tracked the speed, the trajectory, and specifically the jerkiness of the fingers moving the shapes across the glass.
And the findings from the UK completely validated the double empathy problem. When non-autistic adults watched the animations created by the autistic adults, they consistently and drastically failed to accurately interpret the social intentions. They just couldn't read the story the autistic participants were telling with the shape.
Because the failure was traced directly to kinematic similarity. Autistic individuals naturally move differently. Their physical motor profiles often exhibit higher rates of sudden acceleration and deceleration. In biomechanics, this is defined strictly as higher jerk.
Think of it like a physical accent, right? If I move a triangle on a screen and my hand movements have a slight stutter or a rapid acceleration that matches my autistic motor profile, a neurotypical person watching that triangle will just see erratic movement.
Right? They'll think, why is that shape twitching? The animation is broken. Because the neurotypical observer relies on their own internal motor models to understand movement. They cannot read the autistic-generated animations.
The communication broke down entirely because the underlying physical and motor languages were mismatched. The neurotypical participants lacked the empathy and the translation key to understand the autistic motion.
But here is where the research takes a staggering turn. The exact same methodology was replicated in a study conducted in Japan.
Okay.
And the researchers fully expected to find the exact same bidirectional communication failure between Japanese neurotypical adults and Japanese autistic adults.
Because logic dictated that the kinematic mismatch is biological, therefore it should be universal across all culture. Wait, so you're telling me that in Japan, a culture globally famous for requiring people to read the air, to communicate in deeply implicit unspoken ways, and to rely heavily on high-context social cues, the results were different.
The results were not just different. They entirely shattered the baseline assumption. In the Japanese study, there was absolutely no mentalizing difference between the neurotypical group and the autistic group.
Oh.
The Japanese neurotypical adults could read the autistic-generated animations perfectly fine.
The communication gap did not exist.
Furthermore, and this is the critical data point, the Japanese autistic adults significantly outperformed both the neurotypical and the autistic groups from the UK study.
Wow.
The data clearly demonstrated that Japanese autistic individuals possessed a vastly superior ability to accurately read these abstract, geometric social interactions compared to their Western counterparts.
That disparity is incredible. It forces us to completely reevaluate the role of culture in neurology. We have to unpack the specific cultural overlaps that make this possible. How does a high-context culture somehow create an environment where an autistic mind excels at reading abstract social intentions?
Well, we must examine the cultural baseline of Japan, specifically the pervasive influence of Shintoism. Shintoism isn't merely a religion of isolated temples. It is an integrated cultural worldview that normalizes animism.
Right, animism being the attribution of spiritual essence, human intentions, and mind to non-human objects, animals, natural phenomena, and even inanimate shapes.
Anthropomorphism, giving human traits to non-human things, is entirely baked into the daily cultural reality. You see it everywhere. There is an omnipresence of highly expressive mascots representing everything from municipal tax offices to corporate pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
The culture trains the population from birth to look at an abstract, non-human figure and instinctively assign it a deep, coherent emotional state.
Because Japanese individuals are heavily steeped in this environment, they practice anthropomorphism continuously. For an autistic individual in Japan who may already gravitate toward objects or systems over ambiguous human faces, this cultural practice is a massive cognitive advantage. When placed in front of the triangle animations task, they're not struggling to understand abstract shapes. They are executing a culturally reinforced skill. The cultural predisposition to anthropomorphize completely rewires their performance on a standardized Western psychological test.
The culture literally acts as a training ground for the exact cognitive leap the test demands.
Incredible.
Additionally, sociologists define Japan as a highly collectivist, high uncertainty avoidance culture.
Right.
The maintenance of social harmony requires a society that relies heavily on rigidly structured environments, heavily scripted social interactions, and entirely predictable conventions. The goal of the society is to reduce ambiguity and maintain order.
And this societal architecture is a perfect macro-level alignment with the diagnostic criteria for autism. The clinical definition of autism includes a strong preference for routine, a strict adherence to rules, and an intense insistence on sameness. The Japanese cultural framework inadvertently provides a nationwide version of the structural scaffolding that Elias was forced to extract from his anime. The society itself runs on explicit rules.
But, and we must be careful here, while the profound alignment between autistic minds, the structured visual language of anime, and the anthropomorphic macro culture of Japan provides deep comfort, we cannot ignore the inherent friction.
Right, we have to steer this analysis toward the edge of the sanctuary. What happens when the rules of the sanctuary become the only rules a mind can tolerate?
The alignment possesses a very dark side that must be examined. In a highly collectivist, high uncertainty avoidance society, the pressure to conform to the established structure is absolute. The system works precisely because everyone follows the script. There is zero societal tolerance for deviation or disruption of the harmony.
And this intense pressure manifests in the daily reality of the dichotomy between Tatmei and Han. These are foundational concepts in Japanese social dynamics. Tatmei is the required social facade. It is the behavior, the polite agreement, and the opinions one must explicitly display in public to ensure the group remains harmonious.
Conversely, Han represents a person's true, unvarnished internal feelings and desires. Han is heavily guarded and only revealed in deeply private, trusted circles.
Right. And for a neurotypical individual, navigating the space between Tatmei and Han is an expected automatic social reflex.
But for an autistic individual whose cognitive framework inherently values blunt honesty, direct communication, and logical consistency across all environments, this dichotomy is brutal. Maintaining Tatmei requires an agonizing, continuous level of social camouflaging.
They are forced to actively suppress their Han at all times in public spaces. They must consciously execute the script of harmony while their internal logic screams at the contradiction.
And the cognitive and physical toll of this perpetual camouflaging is devastating. It drains executive function and leads to severe burnout.
We see this exact devastation reflected in recent findings surrounding those same ACG communities, the anime, comics, and game subcultures that provide so much belonging. A study investigating creators and hardcore fans within these spaces who possess high autistic traits revealed a severe mental health paradox.
Right. The paradox is that while these heavily structured spaces absolutely provide identity validation and a sanctuary from neurotypical demands, the individuals operating within them report profound mental health challenges.
Yeah.
These challenges are linked directly to the exhaustion of camouflaging. Even within their subcultural sanctuaries, the pressure to perform specific, rigid social roles and maintain the hierarchy of the fandom rapidly drains their psychological resources.
And the reliance on the media itself as a primary mechanism for understanding the world creates another massive vulnerability: the risk of idealized relationships. When a developing mind relies entirely on the unambiguous, highly structured, and perfectly honest relationships found in a fictional visual medium, they develop a dangerously rigid framework for reality.
Fictional characters operate on established narrative rules.
Yeah.
Real human beings do not.
Exactly.
Real people are messy, contradictory, emotionally volatile, and frequently dishonest. They change their minds without warning. They absolutely do not operate on the law of equivalent exchange.
When the individual steps out of the sanctuary and interacts with the real world continuously fails to live up to the logical and emotional standards established by the anime. The amount of effort put into a relationship does not guarantee an equal return of affection.
And this creates a state of profound cognitive dissonance. The individual feels that the world is broken because it is not following the rules.
which leads directly to deep vulnerabilities. Studies show that individuals with high autistic traits who operate predominantly in these highly mediated, logically strict environments exhibit an increased susceptibility to misinformation.
First glance.
Right, if they're highly logical, shouldn't they be better at spotting falsehoods?
Not if the falsehood is formatted correctly. If misinformation or a manipulative ideology is presented to them using a clear, rigid, structurally flawless logic, mimicking the narrative consistency of an anime power system, they are significantly more likely to accept it.
Because they accept the information based on the structural format perfectly matching their preferred cognitive processing style, even if the underlying premise is factually corrupt.
They trust the architecture of the argument more than the messy reality of the evidence. When the chaotic, contradictory reality of human interaction becomes too painful and unpredictable to parse, the individual faces the extreme risk of complete social withdrawal.
They just abandon the attempt to translate the neurotypical world and retreat entirely into the digital sanctuary, where the rules make sense and the faces never lie.
So the clinical goal, therefore, is not to pathologize the affinity or tear down the sanctuary. The objective must be to build functional bridges between the highly structured world of the media and the chaotic, necessary reality of human society.
And we are actually seeing this bridging effect happening organically within the medium of manga itself. The art form is being utilized to heal and educate, rather than simply providing a one-way avenue for hiding. A prime example of this architectural bridge is the manga series With the Light, Raising an Autistic Child by Keiko Tobe.
This specific narrative operates as a direct bidirectional bridge between neurodivergent and neurotypical minds. It doesn't solely focus on entertaining the neurodivergent reader. It demands empathy from the neurotypical observer.
Right. The series meticulously details the daily life of the Azuma family raising their autistic son, Hikaru. It refuses to shy away from the brutality of his neurological reality. There is a specific scene depicting the sheer terror of sensory overload.
Yes.
The family visits a crowded Buddhist temple. To a neurotypical reader, a temple is quiet and peaceful. But the manga visually depicts the environment through Hikaru's neurological architecture.
The visual language completely warps. The panels are consumed by swirling, aggressive lines. The ambient noise of the crowd and the bells is drawn as massive, distorted sound effects that physically crush the character.
And the neurotypical reader is forced to actually see the invisible cognitive load. They experience the corruption of the data in real time.
Instead of focusing the narrative on how Hikaru must undergo therapy to learn how to mimic neurotypical behavior and mask his distress, the media actively educates the neurotypical world on how to accommodate his reality.
There is a deeply powerful moment in the story where a special education teacher, Aoki-sensei, introduces Hikaru to his neurotypical classmates for the first time.
He doesn't ask the class to treat Hikaru as normal. He explicitly explains that Hikaru lives in a world of chaotic, overwhelming senses. He provides the neurotypical children with a simple, profound instruction regarding their autistic peer. Please watch over him warmly.
The manga teaches the society how to provide the accommodation. It shifts the burden of translation.
The comprehensive exploration of visual language, executive functioning frameworks, identity mirrors, and cross-cultural neurology reveals a profound truth about human communication. The deep, sustaining resonance between neurodivergent minds and these seemingly atypical stories is not evidence of a cognitive pathology.
It's not a symptom of a diseased mind seeking a childish escape from the rigors of adult reality. It is a completely rational, highly adaptive response to a society that continuously communicates in shadows, contradictions, and performative ambiguity.
The rigid rules of the magic systems, the unapologetic intensity of the character archetypes, and the vivid, unhidden emotions broadcasted through emanata provide a working blueprint for a coherent universe.
It is a blueprint for a world where people actually say what they mean and feel what they feel without the barrier of a polite mask. It stands as a powerful testament that for many individuals, these stories do not represent a flight into fantasy, but a necessary, unyielding demand for a more honest, coherent, and legible reality. The corporate office mixer is the actual fantasy, a strange, unreadable lottery held by ghosts, operating on rules no one will admit to. The vibrant, exaggerated world on the screen is simply what reality looks like when it finally stops lying.